Hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast dedicated to the policy mix. Let's start with the definition of a policy mix. In lesson 4, we learned about the fiscal policy that the government can put in place. And in lesson 5, we learned about the monetary policy, which is in the hands of the central bank. In practice, these two instruments of economic policy are used together. For example, in the context of the COVID crisis, the government used the fiscal instrument to limit the impact of the health crisis. And, at the same time, the European Central Bank was using all the monetary policy instruments at its disposal to try and stimulate the economic activity. In other words, we use the expression policy mix to designate the combination of fiscal and monetary policies at a given time in a given economy. Often, the fiscal and monetary policies will attempt to respond to the same problems. For example, both will try to have an expansionary effect on the activity and on the income. In this case, they can complement each other, and the government and the central bank will try to find the right dosage between the two policies. If the two instruments follow the same objective, we say that the policy mix is converging. The converging policy mix can be expansionary, but it can also be restrictive, especially in periods of very high inflation. We can also have a policy mix that is diverging, when the fiscal and the monetary policies follow opposite directions. Indeed, the fiscal policy is an instrument controlled by the government, while the monetary policy is controlled by the central bank. So there's no obligation for the central bank, for instance, to follow the policies put in place by the government. Central banks are independent, so they can implement the policies that they think are best, irrespective of what the government is doing. Anyway, after defining the direction of each policy, we will be able to evaluate the impact of the policy mix on income and on the interest rate. Depending on if the policy mix is converging or diverging, we will see different impacts on these two endogenous variables. Let's first look at a converging expansionary policy mix. This means that we have an expansionary fiscal policy, DG higher than 0, and an expansionary monetary policy, DMS higher than 0. The shock on G will increase the income and increase the interest rate. Remember the financial crowding out effect. On the other hand, the shock on MS will decrease the interest rate, which will stimulate investment and income. So these two policies have a certain impact on Y, which will increase in the short term, but they create opposite pressures on the interest rate, upwards for the fiscal policy and downwards for the monetary policy. Let's take two examples to understand this uncertainty on the interest rates. Suppose, first, a strong monetary policy, at least stronger than the fiscal policy. We can see that the interest rate decreases, and the increase in Y is strengthened. There is no crowding out effect, and the decrease in R spurs investment and so triggers a larger multiplier effect in the economy. Suppose now that the fiscal policy is stronger than the monetary policy. In this case, we can see that the interest rate increases, and this time we do have a crowding out effect despite the monetary policy. So overall, If we have two expansionary policies, we are certain about the impact on the income, but the impact on the interest rate is uncertain. In the first case, that you can see represented by the green lines, the monetary policy is stronger than the fiscal policy, while in the second case, represented by the purple lines, the interest rate increases because the shock on G is stronger than the shock on MS. In other words, if we have a policy mix, we need to calculate the multiplier to find out if R increases or decreases in the short term. For Keynesians, the monetary policy is mostly an accompanying instrument to support the fiscal policy. It allows to remove the crowding out effect by maintaining constant the interest rate. Of course, to find the exact dosage to neutralize the impact of the fiscal policy on the interest rate is far from being easy. Also, even if we did, it cannot be a magic solution to stimulate the activity, because remember that we are still in the short term now with fixed prices and wages. Anyway, to sum up, what we can call an accompanying monetary policy is the attempt of the central bank to neutralize the effect of a fiscal policy on the interest rate, and so to remove the crowding out effect. The policy mix can also be diverging when the two policies act in opposite directions on the income. For example, an expansionary fiscal policy DG higher than zero, which will increase income, and a restrictive monetary policy DMS lower than zero, which will decrease Y. These two policies are diverging in the sense that the effect on Y is uncertain, even though the effect on R is certain. The increase in G will push up the interest rate and create a crowding out effect, while the decrease in MS will also push up the interest rate. Suppose first that the shock on G is stronger. Graphically, we can see that in this case, Y will increase despite the restrictive monetary policy, and, as we knew beforehand, the interest rate will increase. Suppose now that the monetary policy is stronger. Again, the interest rate will increase, but we can also see that this time Y will decrease. Here again, we will need to calculate the short-term multiplier to find what the actual impact on Y is. Overall, we can say that the use of the two instruments, fiscal and monetary, triggers a double demand shock in the economy, whose impacts we can sum up in a small table. First, if both policies are expansionary, Y will increase, and the effect on R is uncertain. The COVID response in the EU is an example of such a policy mix. If we have an expansionary fiscal policy and a restrictive monetary policy, which is the case that we've just talked about, we know that R will increase, and the effect on Y is uncertain. Germany, in the beginning of the 1990s, is an example of that. After the reunification, the German government implemented an expansionary fiscal policy to finance the reunification and specifically to finance large infrastructure projects, while the central bank conducted a restrictive monetary policy to limit the risk of inflation. More recently, Donald Trump conducted an expansionary fiscal policy in the US, while the Fed conducted a restrictive monetary policy after years of quantitative easing. Trump actually complained several times in the media about the attitude of the Fed. This, of course, was before the COVID crisis, after which the policy mix in the US became converging and expansionary. Third combination possible, a diverging policy mix with a restrictive fiscal policy and an expansionary monetary policy. The US, at the beginning of the 1990s, is an example of that. Under the presidency of Bill Clinton, the government decided to reduce the public deficit, while at the same time, Alan Greenspan, governor of the Fed, decided to conduct an expansionary monetary policy in order to attenuate the recession triggered by the fiscal policy. Another example is the situation of the Eurozone around 2010. After the financial crisis, European countries chose budget austerity to limit public debt, which encouraged the ECB to conduct a very expansionary monetary policy to mitigate the deflationary risk on the Eurozone. Last combination, converging and restrictive policy mix to limit both public deficits and inflation. An old example of this is the policy conducted by Poincaré in 1926, with the introduction of the franc Poincaré. A more recent example is the case of Germany or the UK at the beginning of the 1980s, when they decided to put in place restrictive fiscal policies and restrictive monetary policies to fight against inflation. Overall, these four combinations constitute double demand shocks. And to know what is going to be the impact on Y and R, we will need to know the relative strength of these two policies.